series, and I got the green light that I'll be teaching this quarter and the next quarter, and so that means we can slow down just a little bit, and which means really I should probably keep the same pace, because I was on pace to finish in 6 months anyway. So we'll be going approximately the same pace. We're still in chapter 3. Last week we were looking at the transition from chapter 1 and 2, which is Solomon looking at the world and seeing the treadmill of everything that's happening and everything that goes on, and there's just this monotony of life, and he sees it from this perspective of under the sun, and as he looks at it, he comes to things like a conclusion. For example, what good is it except to eat, drink, and enjoy the fruits of your labor? And even in this, he sees a vexation of the spirit. And then in chapter 3, it's almost as if he says, now, that's life without God. But now here's life with God. And we almost expect everything to work out now with life with God. Once God is in the picture, everything will work out fine, except that's not what we find. In the rest of the book of Ecclesiastes, if the first 2 chapters were problem of life without God, then what we see in the rest of it is the problem with life with God. And we as Christians understand that concept, that the understanding there, that not everything is perfect, because we don't live around perfect people, because we're not perfect people, because we don't live in a perfect world. All of these things have been tainted by man's decisions, right? And so sometimes injustice still happens. Sometimes the good guy doesn't always win, right? The white hats don't always win. Sometimes the black hats win. And so we come to this time in chapter 3 where he opens up with this we might say the monotony of seasons. For everything, he says there is a season and a time for every matter under the heaven, or a time for every purpose under the heaven. And he goes through this litany, or this list of contrasts, the polar opposites, right? A time to bring life and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up that which is planted. And he goes through all of these, and he gets down this back and forth, creates this restlessness, this tension in life. And what's interesting is that he's not wanting us to bog down in the details of what does he mean by the plant, and what does he mean by plucking up, what does he mean by rending, and what does he mean by sowing. But rather, he wants us to back up for just a moment and see that life is full of variety, and we live within these extremes that happens. It's not just the individual elements within themselves, but we might say all of these elements taken together as an overall description of life. It's not even each individual life. Look, not every person has gone to war, right? Not every person has sown in a field. So it's not just the idea of individuals, but it is life. It is the life under the sun. It is this world, and that there is this plan of God that continues to march forward and onward all of our lives. It never changes. And so the aspects of life are mentioned here as being it's not as if he's saying one in particular is a commendable. It's more commendable to plant than it is to pluck up, or it's more commendable that these things happen. That's not at all. In fact, what it is simply a generalized, descriptive account of the kinds of things that make up human existence. and it can be observed, and that's what we were looking at last week. So we come to we went through 9 and 10, and we kind of started on verse 11. But what gain has the worker from his toil? Solomon revisits some of the same ideas from chapters 1 and 2. I've seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, He has put eternity into man's heart, so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. And so the main point of the poem is that God has established periods and moments or times for a wide diversity of emotions and activities. A diversity in these following verses, he set the stage in 1 through 8, and now in these next verses, he's going to describe his reaction to these observations. He's how does he feel? What gain? He's not just creating tension to create tension. He's saying, these are some of the things that I thought of. These are the things that burned into me. Don't we react much the same way? Moments of life that are odd, or they're out of place, or the treadmill pauses for a second, or suddenly speeds up. Don't we stop and take account and wonder, why did that happen? We talk about the monotony of life, but don't we find a little bit of comfort in that? And life is normal, but not only is it not always a struggle, but we ought to welcome the struggle even, and that's one of the points he's going to get into. And so God has given this business to the children of man. What's interesting here is this word man in the Hebrew is the word Adam. It's the children of Adam. This is the race of humanity, and it's been given to man this business. What business? This business of going through life in the midst of this framework of a time for everything. That's our business, and God has given to us to be busy with. It's the background of how we live. And we might question, when things don't always go well, why bring kids into the world? Why get married? Why build these relations? Why set ourselves up for disappointment and failure? Tim? Yeah, I think there was a book came out maybe 12, 15 years ago about Who Moved the Cheese or something like that. Are y'all familiar with that book? And it was like, in the corporate setting, there are certain goals that we work toward as members of that employment community. And yet sometimes those goals are shifted away, or they're taken off, and we're like a rat in the maze, and we know where the cheese is at the end, but someone moves the cheese. The goals are different, and we've got to adjust and figure life out a second time. And that's kind of, we don't like to do that. We want to be able to get to the end of the maze and the cheese be there at the same place every time. But it doesn't always happen that way. Mark? Yes. Yes, and that's a good point. He'll actually build on that in a couple of verses. But yes, he sets the stage here that there's a difference between man and God, this seems to be this overarching thing is the idea of a plan, right? God has a plan, and when we look at the plan, we don't always understand everything about the plan. Sometimes it's a little beyond what we anticipate. And we have a hard time figuring out the plan from the beginning to the end. Go ahead.
One thing is we don't know what his plan is for us. We have his word to follow and to try to do things, but we have no idea what God's plan is. We get up every day and we have our plan.
Right.
Therein lies the problem. Our plan is the most important thing today. And when things don't go exactly right, then we have issues. But we truly don't know what God's plan is for us. Our job as Christians is to trust God, give him everything, believe in him each and every day, and accept whatever.
Exactly. And so as he lays out, I would see like 4 platforms in the next few verses that says, all right, here's how we should look at life. And the beginning is that God's plan is beautiful. He has made everything, he says, beautiful in its time. God's plan is beautiful. Mark? Some of you may have played video games before. And what happens whenever you play that video game and you get to the end and you've beat all the bosses and you've completed the game? Maybe disappointment. Withdrawal symptoms? Yeah, for some, I know that's true. We usually move on to the next game. We're bored with that game. We know all the ins and outs of that game, and we're bored with it. Life would be the same way, Mark. If we knew all the ins and outs, we had every answer, if we got it all figured out, we'd be bored. But life's not that way. There's always, the cheese is always being moved. There's always a little something different. And we continue to work toward understanding that. And that becomes the drop or the backdrop to our lives. So we trust, as Dale said. The writer says he has made everything beautiful in its time. That's saying to us we need to understand God's plan it's perfect. It's exactly what God wants. There on a keyboard, your piano keyboard. I'll give you just a second, Terry. On the piano keyboard, there are white keys and black keys. What are the black keys? The sharps and the flats. Imagine pieces of music where there were no sharps and there were no flats. There were no things that were just a little bit off. We combine the greatest pieces of music by borrowing from not just the regular notes, but the sharps and the flats too. We build a life under God's plan, and that's the idea here. Is God's plan is beautiful for us, Terry.
I was just wondering if this could be kind of, I don't know what the term would be, but I think of Paul when he talked in Hebrews about being content, that with God, we need to be content. That places our trust in God for whatever's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's again that's a trust thing. Look, I may not have life figured out, God does, and so I'm going to live by His plan. John.
Seems to me, looking at what Mark was saying, if he's put eternity into our heart, then we really can't be satisfied with things here on earth because we're built for eternity. And we're thinking eternal thoughts and looking at eternity and what's here just doesn't fit.
Yes.
We always need
And that's a great observation, because I think that's exactly what he means by he put eternity in our hearts. That the scriptures speak of our creation in the image or the glory of God, Genesis 1, a glory which is largely forfeited by us when we choose sin. Romans chapter 3 and verse 23, we fall short of the glory of God. Yet it's not obliterated, because we still have this opportunity to come back to God and find that glory that he wants. And so our consciousness of God is part of our nature, that we long for this something more, this eternity. And so we're restless. We're restless, which is a picture that is painted in the Old Testament throughout the wilderness wanderings. You remember what they were looking for, a place of what? Rest. They wanted that rest. And so we come into the book of Hebrews, chapter 3 and chapter 4, and he says, look, they didn't get the rest, because ultimately the rest that we seek is a presence with God. So a consciousness of God and his glory is built into every one of us. It's an innate sense of knowing there's something greater. Now, can we ignore that? A lot of people do. We appease it by, the world appeases it by many different things. And we've talked about those addictions and vices and everything from drug addictions to recreational softball league or something. We're finding something that will fit in this, I've said it before, this God-shaped hole. And we can pound things in there, and we can drive them, and we can shave off corners and edges and try to make it fit. But really, there's only one thing that fits in the God-shaped hole, and it's God. And it's there for us and that's what's so beautiful about this, is that we have this consciousness of God. We know that he's there. And so he says, I perceive that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. Also that everyone should eat and drink and take pleasure in all his toil. This is God's gift to man. If we see in these verses that God's plan is beautiful, in verse 11, we also see that God's plan is mysterious. I was going to mention this, but we cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end, right? It's like someone who is severely, severely nearsighted and goes to see the works of the Sistine Chapel, right? And he looks up and he can't make out anything because he's too nearsighted. And so he convinces them to raise him up on a scaffold or a ladder. And he's allowed to view the Sistine Chapel from right here. And at this point, he can see the brushwork and the color work, and it's amazing to him. But the problem is he doesn't see the whole picture, right? He's blinded to the grand scheme. Well, that's us. We're seeing, this much of eternity. And while it's beautiful to us, and while there are the brushstrokes are amazing, and the colors are inspiring to us, and life itself is something that we're meant to enjoy, what we don't see is beginning to end. We don't see the whole picture, but God does. God sees the whole picture. He has painted everything. He has put it all together. And everything that he does is exactly what he anticipates. It's what he wants. Every move that he makes is part of that plan. I think sometimes we get into this idea that God and the devil are in a tennis match, right? So God creates, and then Satan destroys, and then God calls Abraham. And then Satan confounds the Jews. And then God banishes man from the garden, and Satan corrupts civilization. And it's like they're going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. No. God has a plan. And that plan is to save mankind since he fell. That's God's plan. And everything he does, he's not doing it to overcome the last volley from the devil. Everything is set in order. It's beautiful, and it's unknown to us, but God knows. And there's where our comfort is. And so God's plan is beautiful. God's plan is mysterious. That third platform is that God's plan is supreme. It is the sovereign will of God. And again, as Dale mentioned a moment ago, the plans that we make are really subject to the plans of God. And so the joyful life, the happy life, is the life that says, these are, if the Lord will, plans, right? From James chapter 4, I will go into such and such a city and buy and sell and get gain. James says, what we ought to say is, if the Lord wills, I will go into those cities and I will buy and sell and get gain, as it is called to do. So the idea is don't be discouraged when you realize that you're not in control, that you don't control everything. Be joyful. That's the idea here. I perceive there is nothing better for them than to be joyful. I know there's a lot of people who, when they're out of control, they're uncomfortable, right? Do you know people like that? I know people, if they're not in the driver's seat in the vehicle, they're uncomfortable, right? Are you one of those that when it's time to go somewhere, hey, let's take my car because we want to be in control? If we could, we'd sit in the pilot seats in the airplane, right? Because I want to be in control. And then when they're out of control, or when they're not the one who is pulling the strings, there's discomfort there. There's a dissonance in our lives. And instead of feeling overwhelmed, uncomfortable, left behind, or whatever the feeling is when you're not in control, Solomon's saying, look, here's God's plan. It's beautiful. It's mysterious to us. It's supreme. It governs everything. And the best we can do, or what we ought to do, is just learn to be happy in those moments. And to do good. Live a life that is beneficial. I don't think Solomon here is necessarily saying, live that moral life. He's saying, use your life here on this earth to benefit society. We're created together. Now, how is that going to happen? Obviously through moral living, but the idea is that, let your life be something beneficial toward society. Don't be anxious about tomorrow, Jesus would say. For tomorrow will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day is what? Its own troubles. That's right. There's enough today to address that we don't have to start worrying about tomorrow, being anxious about the things that are beyond our control. Usually when we feel out of control, we are saddened or distressed or even depressed at times. But for the Christian, we say, God will handle it. I'll just enjoy his gifts. Notice, this is God's gift to man. God has wrapped it up and he's handed it to us and said, this is what I want you to be able to have. Don't fret over the trials and the suffering of life. Those days will catch up with us. Until then, enjoy what God has given you. Worry and dread is about things that might happen in the future. And if we are constantly concerned about the future, the present passes us by. God says, I want you to enjoy the now. Now, Christianity isn't just a life living in anticipation of the judgment day and thereafter. Jesus said, I came that they might have life and have it more abundantly. He's not just talking about eternal life in the beyond. He's talking about life here today, right now, that our lives today could be full. And then he goes into this, he should eat, drink, and take pleasure in his toil and all of his toil, all his labors. This is the second time that Solomon has directed man to enjoy life as it comes to him, to eat, drink, and enjoy his labor. In the first declaration, in chapter 2 and verse 24, there was both the pleasure and the vexation of enjoyment when considered from under the sun. But here, secularism gives way to theism. Now we're going to say these things in reference to the existence of God. Pessimism gives way to optimism. Human autonomy gives way to human faith. You see, we think we're autonomous, and I will do what I want to do by my plans. You see, that's human autonomy. Human faith says, I will do as God wills by his plan. I perceived that whatever God does endures forever. Nothing can be added to it, nor nothing taken away from it. God has done it, so that people fear before him. That which is already has been, that which is to be already has been, and God seeks what has been driven away. And so now he comes to this, all right, God's plan is beautiful, God's plan is mysterious, God's plan is supreme, and the final platform, the final truth that we look at life with is that we rest in God's sovereignty. We rest in God's plan. And it's an acceptance with him being in control, and instead of fretting, take rest. In Texas, driver's ed mostly was parent taught, which meant when your child was 15 and a half, and they got their permit, you put them in the driver's seat and you sat in the passenger seat and you let them drive. And they pulled out in front of oncoming cars, and they ran over curbs, and they couldn't park between the lines when you started, right? And you were out of control. There was some fretting. In fact, there was a lot of fretting. A lot of yelling. But my children lived. It was good on them. We all lived. But here's the idea is that instead of fretting, take rest. Isn't it wonderful whenever your children get to that point when they're driving and you can sit in the passenger seat and take a nap? Julie's laughing because she knows I did that. I'm okay. I don't have to constantly direct them on how to drive. You got it, son. I'm just going to roll over here and take a little nap. Isn't that essentially what we're doing with God? God, I know you have this. I know that you've got a plan. I know things are working for your plan. And even moments that are stressful to me, it's part of your grand design to save me. And so I'm going to take my rest in you. Whatever God does endures forever. It's what you have chosen. Our business, from the secularist point of view, is a burden put upon us, but from the spiritual point of view, it's an assignment. It's a gift from God. It's an allotted portion in life whose purpose is known to God, the great giver, and is part of his everlasting work. That's what God has done for us. 3 aspects of God's action are highlighted. First is the permanence. What God has done endures forever. It's the permanence of God. And so there's no possibility of failure in God, right? When God determines something, who can thwart his actions? Can the devil come along and steal his son from him and kill him on the cross and thwart God's action of bringing salvation and redemption to mankind? No, that's the very plan of God. The devil played right into God's plan, and therefore we have salvation. Second, in God's actions is it's effective and it is effective and complete. Nothing can be added to it. It works. It just works, and we don't need to modify it. We don't need to come in and say, well, God, you messed up, so let me fix this for you. None of His works are to be abandoned. And then third, His actions are totally secure. No part or aspect can be endangered by any alien force. God has done it so that people fear Him. So nothing can be taken from it. It's not going to be trumped. They're totally secure. God doesn't have to worry about those things. And all this leads on part to man's fear, right? And then there we have that idea of fear. What kind of fear are we to have? Huh? A reverent fear? A godly fear? What does that mean? Terry? Yes, exactly. And I think I mentioned this last week in Philippians in the sermon. We were talking about you work out your own salvation how? With fear and trembling. It's a picture. It paints a picture of terror before God. We work out our salvation with terror of God because it's a fearful thing to fall in the hands of the living God, right? But then someone comes along and says, wait a minute, Paul told Timothy, you've not been given a spirit of fear, but of power, right? So do we have a spirit of fear? Or do we not have a spirit of fear? We have a spirit of fear toward God. What Paul was telling Timothy is, don't be afraid of those who despise your youth. Don't be afraid of those who threaten your life. Don't be afraid of those who don't like what you say. You be afraid of God. And isn't that what Solomon's telling us too? Our fear is not of, what if things don't go my way? What if I get cancer? What if I die at a young age? What if my children die? Those are fears that we sometimes have in this life. And what he's saying is our fear ought to be before God. And what God does. That which has already been, he says. Solomon revisits a theme from chapter 1, verse 9. In fact, the very first part, that which is, already has been, and that which is to be, already has been. That's verse 9, chapter 1, verse 9. But now he adds what? And God seeks what has been driven away. That's kind of an odd phrase. The basic meaning is, before we saw the treadmill, and it's as if there was no mechanism, no power driving the treadmill. It was just the belt in midair doing this, and we were on it and running, and we couldn't stop it. But now we see the mechanism behind it. We see the power, and it's what? God. The plan of God. This all works within the plan of God. He seeks, or maybe another translation, he watches. God's watching what has been driven away. The translation here is a little uncertain on the word driven away. Another possible translation is the idea of hurries along. Now, if we put it in the context, remember life without God, there was just this vexation. There was an unknown. It was uncomfortable because we didn't know the driving force, but now we know the driving force. And it's God, and what God is doing is He's watching as life hurries along. I think that's probably a good interpretation of that last phrase, God seeks what has been driven away. God watches life as it hurries along. And in the modern vernacular, then, God's got this, right? God, you got this. We trust Him for watching over the earth. Go ahead. Yeah, I mean, He does, but I think here Solomon is looking at the big picture, that God is watching over everything as it hurries along. People, nature, the earth, the universe, everything is under God's constant watchful eye. Like the song that we sing, there's an all-seeing eye watching you. That creeped me out as a teenager, but anyway. Life, and yeah, but the idea here is just that everything is still, it keeps its motion because of God, and so the hurry or the driven away, I guess that would depend on how you interpreted that. Moreover, I saw under the sun that in the place of justice, even there was wickedness, and in the place of righteousness, even there was wickedness. And I said in my heart, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and every work. And he visits that idea, the time for every matter from chapter, from the first verse of this chapter, right? Solomon deals with 4 areas of life that every person wonders about, where God is missed. Sometimes God is missing. We anticipate Him to be there, but He was not. In 1947, Simon Wiesenthal formed a group of volunteers to help prosecute Nazi war criminals. And he had spent time in the concentration camps and labor camps of the Nazis during the war as a Jew. Once, when discussing the atrocities of the camp, he made the famous statement, "God is on leave." God went on vacation. God wasn't there. It's easy to imagine the atrocities of the Holocaust happening to us or to our loved one, and like Job's wife, ready to curse God and just die. God, how can you allow this to happen? And the first area of life that he picks up on is justice. The idea of justice. The mantle of what we might say is inequality. Isn't that what he says? Where you would go to law and you would expect justice to take place, what happens? Wickedness or injustice. Where you would think righteousness, surely these people are the righteous people. And he says, but you find unrighteousness. Do you remember in Jeremiah chapter 9 when he is wishing that he had a place where he could get away from his people? He said, I want to leave the Jews because every brother utterly supplants. And their lips were filled with lies. There's no truth in them. He says, I don't want to be around these people anymore because they're unrighteous. Well, you would expect the people of God to be the most righteous people. But he found even there wickedness. Sometimes bad guys win, good guys suffer. If God instantly brought justice for every slight against you, isn't that what we want? We want the good guys to always win, right? We always want the bad guy punished. Until what? Until I'm the bad guy. And then we want God to be patient. God, hold off and give me just a little bit of time to turn it around. Right? Isn't that what we really want? God's not on leave. The question isn't why does God punish evil or why doesn't God punish evil and injustice? The real question is, why doesn't God punish evil right now? Because we know in His grand scheme there's a heaven and there's a hell, right? And we know that eventually all things will balance out and the righteous will win in the end. But so the question is not whether or not God will punish evil and justice. The question is, why doesn't He do it right now? Well, it's because God doesn't settle all of His accounts in October, right? The two farmers lived next to each other, and the one was an atheist. You have a question, Terry, or do I need to do something? That's right. So here's the two farmers, and one's an atheist and one's a believer, and every Sunday the believer left his field and would go to worship and he would praise God, and the atheist, he got to stay and work his crops, and come harvest time in September and October, the atheist field yielded 2 times the amount of grain that the believers did. And the atheist mocked him. He said, if there was a God, surely He would have given you a better crop yield than He gave me. But look at me, I've got twice the amount of grain that you have. And the farmer who believed in God looked at him and said, well, God doesn't settle all of His accounts in October. There's an accounting day coming. And it's not in October. It's on the judgment day. Dale? Absolutely. Absolutely. The psalmist says in Psalm 73 and verse 17, he talks about the wicked and how they appear to gain ground, to be prosperous. And he says, until I went into the sanctuary of God, and then I discovered their end. You see, we can talk about inequities and injustice in life until we go to God and we see the end of the wicked and the righteous. And then we understand. Then we see the equity of God. Okay, we'll pick up there next week at verse 18.